Hey everyone, Nigel and Luke here, and welcome to another edition of Crimes of the Week International. Authorities in Western Australia have released the details of a recent international police operation this week, one that is being credited as Australia's largest ever drug bust, and was allegedly responsible for preventing roughly 2.4 metric tons of cocaine from making it into the country. According to reports, the incident began in late November of last year when U.S. authorities intercepted the massive drug shipment off the coast of Ecuador. The shipment was allegedly comprised of 2.4 metric tons of cocaine and was being transported by a Mexican drug cartel bound for Western Australia. Authorities say that had the drugs made it into the country, they would have had a street value of approximately 1 billion Australian dollars, or about $662 million US. When US officials notified their counterparts in Western Australia, they decided to set a trap for the smugglers. Rather than making it known that the shipment had been discovered, police switched out the cocaine with fake drugs made of plaster of Paris. Knowing that cartel members would be expecting the illegal haul to arrive sometime in December, authorities in Western Australia took half of the fake shipment and dropped the packages into the Indian Ocean, about 50 miles off the coast. Sure enough, the cartel members took the bait and sent 2 boats to retrieve what they thought were their drugs. One of the vessels ended up beached about 40 miles north of Perth, after which 3 suspects on board were arrested. Police then waited for the second boat to come and tow the first, before following it and arresting 6 more suspects at a harbor in Perth. Even then, though, the operation wasn't quite over. You see, the cartel still thought the other half of the 2.4-ton shipment was sitting in a warehouse. One man was arrested after he came to the warehouse and left with about 450 pounds of the fake drugs, while 2 others were arrested while driving a car containing $2 million in cash. For those keeping track at home, that brings the total number of arrests up to 12. To put the whole thing in perspective, Western Australian authorities say that the record 2.4 metric tons of drugs seized equates to about half of the country's total cocaine consumption in a year. In other words, police believe they've made quite the dent in cartel profits. At the time of this recording, none of the names of those arrested have been released. All of the men currently remain in custody, though, and are said to be between the ages of 19 and 67. Remember that whole gross situation a couple years ago when people were filming themselves licking the contents of Bluebell ice cream containers, then putting them back on the shelf? Like all of these stupid online trends, it of course became particularly popular on TikTok, where it was known as the Ice Cream Challenge. Well, it seems that Japan is now dealing with their own disgusting viral trend, one which has been labeled sushi terrorism. It all started last month when the viral video that set off the whole trend was filmed inside of a chain restaurant called Kura Sushi. Kura Sushi is what's known as a kaiten sushi or conveyor belt sushi restaurant. Even if you've never been to one, you've probably at least seen or heard of them before. If not, it's exactly what it sounds like. Basically, you sit down at a table and your orders are delivered to you by these little conveyor belts. It's pretty cool. What's not so cool is what happened on February 3rd, when the trio of suspects who allegedly set off the whole disgusting debacle filmed themselves doing unsanitary things to other people's food and communal items. In particular, one of them could be seen grabbing someone else's piece of sushi from a plate as it passes, shoving the whole thing in their mouth, and then drinking from and licking a communal soy sauce bottle before putting it back on the conveyor belt. As with anything like this that goes viral, unfortunately the incident quickly inspired copycats, and soon countless other videos began to emerge of people doing similar things at conveyor belt restaurants across the country. Examples ranged from people licking their fingers and touching people's passing food, to licking chopsticks, to sucking the rim of a teacup before putting it back on the shelf. Come to think of it, saliva was somehow involved in most of the so-called pranks. Of course, most normal people were rightfully disgusted by this, feeling equal parts grossed out and helpless. Because the thing about this kind of dining experience is that it only really works as long as some level of public trust can be extended. Once people started to see this, it had a real impact on sushi chains across the country, many of whom, like Kura Sushi and Sushiro, saw their stock prices plummet. This week, though, Japanese authorities in the city of Nagoya announced that they had arrested the suspects allegedly responsible for the original incident. So far, it appears that only the man actually accused of licking the soy sauce bottle has been named, 21-year-old Ryoga Yoshino, though the two others have been identified as a 15-year-old girl and a 19-year-old man. It's unclear if the suspects have yet been formally charged, though some local news sources we came across speculated that they could be slapped with forcible obstruction of business. If so, they could be looking at up to 3 years in prison. As for the kaiten sushi restaurants themselves, they are now taking steps to try and mitigate the chances of something like this happening again. Some are now requiring customers to collect their own utensils and condiments, while Kura Sushi is developing an alarm system with sensors and cameras that are supposed to detect if plates are tampered with. Sadly, some chains have decided to hang up the conveyor belt model for good, saying that they now believe the only way they can properly ensure their customers' safety is by bringing dishes to them directly. At the time of this recording, the situation is still developing. Authorities in the German state of Lower Saxony say that a teenager is dead this week and an elderly man is in critical condition after a neighborly dispute boiled over into a tragic shooting. According to reports, the incident took place at around 7:30 a.m. on March 1st, when the victim, identified only as 16-year-old Sinan F., was on his way to school. As he exited his apartment building, he was allegedly confronted by his elderly neighbor, identified as 81-year-old Giuseppe Del B, and the two began to argue. Things took a chilling turn when Giuseppe reportedly took out a small-caliber handgun and shot Sinan 3 times. One of the rounds reportedly struck him in the head. Witnesses claim that the elderly attacker then attempted to shoot Sinan's mother, but missed. After that, he turned his weapon on himself. While both of the wounded were rushed to a local hospital, sadly, Sinan was too badly injured and died shortly after arriving. The 81-year-old alleged shooter reportedly remains in critical condition, though police say that he is expected to survive. He has now been arrested on suspicion of murder and attempted manslaughter. Though little additional information is available about the case at the current time, most reports we came across state that investigators believe the tragic killing stemmed from a long and ongoing dispute between Giuseppe and Sinan's family. The teen and his family lived above the elderly Italian national, and he had often complained that they made too much noise. That being said, at the time of this recording, it's unclear what specifically led to this week's fatal argument. U.S. officials say that 2 American citizens are dead this week and 2 have been rescued after they traveled to Mexico so that one of them could undergo a medical procedure, and they were the victims of a violent kidnapping. The incident began on the morning of March 3rd when the victims, Latavia Washington McGee, Eric Williams, Shaid Woodward, and Zindell Brown, crossed over the southern border from Brownsville, Texas, into the Mexican city of Matamoros. The group had reportedly traveled from South Carolina so that McGee could receive a cosmetic surgery. The 4 crossed into Matamoros at around 9:18 a.m. that morning, and most of them weren't supposed to be long. According to a woman who had traveled with them but who was unable to cross the border because she had forgotten her ID, the men were just supposed to drop McGee off for her surgery before coming back to Brownsville to meet up with her. However, they never returned. Based on a timeline of events released by local news sources and the FBI, it's now alleged that after getting into Matamoros, the group of Americans got lost. They tried to call the clinic where the procedure was supposed to happen for directions, but encountered difficulty due to poor cell phone signal. Not long after, things took a harrowing turn. As the 4 were driving in their van, they were reportedly ambushed by several gunmen believed to be members of the notorious Gulf Cartel. The men cut off the van on the road and fired upon it, resulting in a crash. Horrifyingly, McGee, Williams, Woodward, and Brown were then forcefully dragged from their vehicle and loaded into the back of a white pickup truck before being driven from the scene. A 33-year-old Mexican woman, believed to be a bystander, was also killed at the scene. When U.S. officials were notified about what happened, a massive effort was launched with the help of Mexican authorities. In the meantime, the 4 victims were moved around to various safe houses to avoid detection. This carried on for 4 days, until on March 7th, the group was found at a house only a few miles away from where they had initially been kidnapped. McGee and Williams were injured but alive, though sadly, Woodward and Brown were dead. It's unclear if the injuries that killed them were a result of the initial shooting, or whether they were attacked again later on. The survivors have since returned home, while the bodies of the deceased are still in the process of being repatriated at the time of this recording. Currently, the exact circumstances that led up to the terrifying incident remain unknown, though the situation is swirling with speculation. Perhaps the most credible theory at this point is that the whole thing was a case of mistaken identity. In particular, many American media outlets have speculated that the cartel members responsible for the attack may have confused the victims with members of a rival organization, likely Haitian gang members. Many of the Mexican media outlets we've come across, meanwhile, appear to have taken a more conspiratorial approach. They've speculated that the victims were somehow involved in drug trafficking and that this is what prompted the attack. So far, it appears there is little to back up this theory, though, with some of the speculation likely fueled in part by the hostility many Mexicans expressed online about how quickly and decisively law enforcement in the country reacted to the kidnapped Americans versus the thousands of kidnappings involving their own citizens that go unsolved every year. At the time of this recording, it appears that at least one person has been arrested in connection with this week's deadly incident, though the investigation is very much ongoing. Representatives from England's Avon and Somerset police say that a motorist got quite the surprise last week when he made a rude hand gesture while doing something illegal, only to realize that the person he had just done it to was an undercover cop. According to reports, the situation unfolded on the afternoon of March 3rd, when unmarked units from Avon and Somerset's road policing team were out conducting undercover mobile phone enforcement on local roads. They were on the lookout when a female officer spotted a man next to them who had his cell phone up to his ear and was talking away. The man continued his conversation for a moment until noticing he was being filmed. That's when he put down the phone and stuck up his middle finger. Unfortunately for the driver, though he had realized he was being filmed, he hadn't bothered to consider why. It was because police were out looking for people exactly like him breaking road safety laws, and he had just handed them an extra little gift. While the police department did not mention in their press release about the incident what happened next, the female officer in video footage captured of the incident could be heard laughing after getting flipped off and saying to her colleagues, quote, "I've got one for you." So I think it's probably safe to say that things didn't end well for the unidentified driver. In a post to Twitter, authorities criticized the man, saying that his behavior shows the, quote, "total disregard some people have for the law and road safety." Authorities in the Thai capital of Bangkok say that they were treated to some very interesting drunk logic this week when they allegedly caught 3 intoxicated armed robbers in the middle of mugging a tourist, and they promptly tried to claim that they were the victims. The whole thing went down sometime last week when the victim, identified only as a 28-year-old Romanian tourist, was waiting to catch a bus in Bangkok's popular Khao San area. He was standing outside of a department store when all of a sudden he was approached by 3 men, all of whom were either 24 or 25. According to reports, the trio proceeded to attack the tourist, with one of them flashing a gun at him while another pulled out a long knife. Understandably terrified, the tourist agreed to hand over the equivalent of about $50 US in cash, as well as his $1,000 cell phone. Luckily for the 28-year-old, he was in the middle of placing the phone down on the ground when police saw what was going on and intervened. The victim ended up getting all of his money and belongings back safely. As for the suspects, they quickly tried to turn the tables on the whole situation by offering police a rather interesting excuse. According to them, they weren't robbers. No, they were simply humble drug dealers. The men went on to say that everything was the tourist's fault. They had just been trying to sell him some weed when he signaled that he wanted cocaine instead. Affronted that the man would even ask for something so unethical, the pearl-clutching drug dealers claimed that they had refused to help the tourist further. That's when he attacked them, they said. The fact that it was 3-on-1 and they had knives and guns was completely incidental in their telling the story. Apparently, they claimed that they were forced to use these weapons in self-defense. Understandably, there were several problems with this story, one of which obviously being why the tourist was laying his cash and valuables on the street when police arrived if he was the one who had attacked. Of course, the suspects were later found to be quite drunk, so there were bound to be a few logical holes in their obviously made-up recounting of events. The 3 were arrested at the scene, though so far have not been identified by name. It's unclear if they are yet facing formal charges. Authorities in England say that a nearly 2-month-long nationwide manhunt came to a tragic end last week after a missing aristocrat and her lover were arrested and the remains of their newborn baby were found under grisly circumstances. The whole thing began on January 5th when 35-year-old Constance Martin, 48-year-old Mark Gordon, and their newborn baby Victoria went missing. The disappearance set off alarm bells after their abandoned and burnt-out car was found on the side of a highway near the northwestern English town of Bolton. Inside the vehicle were belongings that had mostly been destroyed in the fire, though Martin's passport was recovered from the wreckage. According to reports, Martin comes from an aristocratic family with connections to the British monarchy, though has been estranged from her own family for several years. Though the details of her estrangement have not been entirely released, many reports have suggested that much of it has to do with her lover, Mark Gordon, with whom she had been living with for several years at the time of her disappearance. Gordon previously served a 20-year sentence in the United States for sexual assault, after which he was deported back to the UK. Almost immediately following Martin and Gordon's disappearance with their child, sightings began to come in from members of the public. It was the beginning of a multi-week cat-and-mouse game in which police attempted to catch up with them while they continued to stay on the move. The entire time, pleas were released by Martin's family for her safe return, though many, including authorities, were specifically concerned about the safety of her and Gordon's newborn child. Chillingly, when Martin and Gordon were finally located and taken to custody on February 27th in Brighton, it was without their baby. By this time, they had already been captured several times on surveillance video traveling without the child, and a warrant had been issued for their arrests. Sadly, everyone's worst fears were confirmed on March 1st, when during a massive search effort, authorities managed to recover the body of the missing child. The infant had been wrapped in a plastic bag and buried under some diapers in a shed on an overgrown allotment, which was also located in Brighton. According to reports, Martin and Gordon are now each facing charges of manslaughter by way of gross neglect, concealment of the birth of a child, and perverting the course of justice. At the time of this recording, there are still many unanswered questions as to what led up to the tragic situation. Many who know Martin have suggested that there is more to the story, with many reports now detailing disturbing allegations that she was, quote, groomed by Gordon, and that she had been brainwashed by a Nigerian religious cult which she reportedly lived with as a teenager. However, at the current time, it's unclear how much of this has been substantiated by police, and the investigation continues. People across the Philippines are terrified and outraged this week after a brazen and deadly attack on one of the country's governors claimed the lives of at least 9 people. According to reports, the incident took place on the morning of March 4th when the governor of Negros Oriental province, Roel Degamo, was meeting with local officials and constituents at his home in the town of Pamplona. Things appeared perfectly normal until a group of about 10 heavily armed men in what appeared to be military gear arrived at Dagamo's compound. After making their way inside and asking to speak with the governor, they reportedly began to open fire. While authorities say there's no question that Dagamo was the target, witnesses state that the attackers shot indiscriminately at anyone else who happened to be in their way. Sadly, 9 people, including the governor, are said to have been killed during the terrifying shooting. At least 13 others reportedly remain in the hospital, while 4 more suffered minor injuries. Local news sources state that police and military personnel were quick to respond to the situation, and so far have been able to arrest 3 of those allegedly involved in the crime. A 4th man was reportedly killed in a shootout with authorities, and several weapons, including multiple rifles, a grenade launcher, and a large supply of ammunition were seized. The president of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has vowed to take whatever action is necessary to find the rest of the culprits and bring them to justice. While no motive has been released behind this week's tragedy, it has been reported that 2 of the suspects arrested were former soldiers who were dishonorably discharged from the country's military several years ago. The attack is also just one of an emerging pattern of similar disturbing attacks on government leaders to occur lately. On February 17th, 4 police officers were killed and 3 others, including another provincial governor, were wounded in a roadside ambush in the country's south. Before that, a gunman disguised as a police officer also killed the vice mayor and 5 companions who were traveling in a van in Nueva Vizcaya province. At the time of this recording, investigations into this week's crime, as well as these others, remain ongoing. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a minute to thank our amazing supporters over on Patreon. As many of you are aware, our situation on YouTube always seems to be a bit uncertain, but our patrons help to ensure that we can continue to make content like this long term without having to worry as much about what surprises might be thrown our way. Plus, patrons also get access to 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. If you'd like to help support the channel directly, head over to patreon.com/crimezone to join. You can also find that link in the description below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and take care.